Hi, and welcome back to our series of training videos for the Adaptive Fisheries Assessment and Management Toolkit. In this particular session, we'll talk about Step 4, which is determining harvest control rules. So as a quick refresher, what are harvest control rules? Harvest control rules help you determine how to adjust fishing mortality or your fishery management controls based on how your performance indicators are doing. So this helps you determine how much should you increase or decrease fishing mortality or fishing pressure, and by how much. And this is a function of how your performance indicators are doing relative to their reference points. Are things above the target, things between the target and the limit, or are things below the limit? And based on where your indicators fall in this spectrum, you'll want to think about how you'll want to adjust your fishing management controls accordingly. Here's an example of how a harvest control rule would affect a population over time. So on the x-axis we have the year, and on the y-axis we have fish to unfished biomass ratio. So we start off at 1, so let's think about a fishery that's not being fished, and over time this number decreases as we fish it harder and harder. So eventually we drop below this 60% threshold, and we think about, alright, what happens if we drop below 60 but are still above 20? We might want to reduce the length of our open season to make sure we stay above 20. If we drop below 20, this might be a dangerous situation. We'd want to close the fishery. If we go above 60, we might think about no restrictions. And so our harvest control rule essentially says what we would do in our fishery if we fell in one of these brackets. And as you can see, over time, we'd stay right where we want to be, which is below this 60% but above the 20%. Step 4A is to develop harvest control rules for all combinations of performance indicators relative to their reference values. There's a lot of great tables in the guidance document to help you through this, but we can walk through an example. Here's what a harvest control rule table would look like in a framework with 2 indicators. Say you collect length data and underwater visual survey data, and you want your indicators to be fishing mortality, let's say from catch curve, and biomass ratio. To create your table, you first think about what are the different scenarios, the different combinations that these indicators might be. With a 2-indicator framework, there are 4 different scenarios. We could have both fishing mortality and biomass ratio are in good shape. We could have that fishing mortality is not in good shape, but biomass ratio is. We could have the opposite situation, or we could see that both indicators are not doing well. Now for each possible scenario, as a group of stakeholders, we want to think about the likely interpretation of what's going on in the fishery that might lead to these 2 indicators to be as they are, and then think about the harvest control rule. So how would fishery management controls actually be adjusted if we thought this situation was occurring? Now it's important to think about every possible scenario so that when we actually do run our assessments and we get some numbers and we see where we fall, everyone's already agreed on what they think the interpretation should be and also what the harvest control rule should be. It's really important to do this ahead of time to increase transparency and accountability to make sure that when the numbers do come out, everyone's committed to following through. Now here's an example with a 2-indicator framework. Things become a bit more complicated if we add a 3rd indicator. So let's say we're also collecting catch per unit effort data. In this case, we might add a 3rd CPUE indicator. So now we have 3 indicators. Now, things get a bit more complicated because there are 8 possible combinations of how these indicators might look. And now for each of these 8 scenarios, we would need to think about the likely interpretation and the harvest control rule. Now, this can be a challenging step and often requires a lot of discussion between stakeholders, because it's often possible that you'll have indicators saying conflicting messages. This is okay though. The AFAM Toolkit guidance document provides several examples of how to think about conflicting indicators and how you might interpret this. And importantly, it's also really critical to rely on local knowledge, because often fishers will understand why certain indicators might be conflicting with each other. Once we've outlined a basic harvest control rule table, the next step is to be as specific as possible. So for example, if our performance indicator is X% below the target, reduce the allowable catch by Y%. Now, how do we determine what the specificity should be? There's a couple of considerations. One is the productivity of the species. Are they very fast growing? Are they likely to respond very quickly to changes in management? What are the feasibility and enforceability and expected compliance of a certain harvest control rule? It's really important to think about doing something that will not only help the fishery, but is something that fishers will comply with. It's also really important to think about uncertainty and risk tolerance for the stakeholders and management involved in the fishery. And also if there's a no-take zone and how big that no-take zone is. Often a no-take zone can act as a buffer against uncertainty. The dashboard has a simple system for recording your harvest control rules. Now, I recommend when first making your harvest control table to do this on a big sheet of paper or a whiteboard with your stakeholders gathered around. I think that's the most tactile and easy way to do this. Once you've done that, you can record all of your harvest control rules in the dashboard. Based on your indicators, it will automatically create places for you to enter each of your interpretations and harvest control rules for all combinations of indicators. So for this group breakout activity, I encourage you to look through the instructions and references provided in step 4, and then go through and actually generate your harvest control rule tables using the online dashboard and toolkit worksheet. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you back for the next session.